Chapter 12. The Evidence of the Missing Body. Was Jesus' body really absent from his tomb? Candy heiress Helen Voorhees Brock flew into the world's busiest airport on a crisp autumn afternoon, stepped into a crowd, and promptly disappeared without a trace. For decades, the mystery of what happened to this red-haired, animal-loving philanthropist has baffled police and journalists alike. While investigators are convinced she was murdered, they haven't been able to determine the specific circumstances, largely because they've never found her body. Police have floated some speculation, leaked tantalizing possibilities to the press, and even got a judge to declare that a con man was responsible for her disappearance. But absent a corpse, her murder officially remains unsolved. Nobody has ever been charged with her slaying. The Brock case is one of those frustrating enigmas that keep me awake from time to time as I mentally sift through the sparse evidence and try to piece together what happened. Ultimately, it's an unsatisfying exercise. I want to know what happened, and there just aren't enough facts to chase away the conjecture. Occasionally, bodies turn up missing in pulp fiction and in real life, but rarely do you encounter an empty tomb. Unlike the case of Helen Brock, the issue with Jesus isn't that he was nowhere to be seen. It's that he was seen alive. He was seen dead. And he was seen alive once more. If we believe the gospel accounts, this isn't a matter of a missing body. No, it's a matter of Jesus still being alive, even to this day. Even after publicly succumbing to the horrors of crucifixion so graphically depicted in the preceding chapter. The empty tomb, as an enduring symbol of the resurrection, is the ultimate representation of Jesus' claim to being God. The Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 17, that the resurrection is the very linchpin of the Christian faith. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. Theologian Gerald O'Collins put it this way: in a profound sense, Christianity without the resurrection is not simply Christianity without its final chapter. It is not Christianity at all. The resurrection is the supreme vindication of Jesus' divine identity and his inspired teaching. It's the proof of his triumph over sin and death. It's the foreshadowing of the resurrection of his followers. It's the basis of Christian hope. It's the miracle of all miracles, if it's true. Skeptics claim that what happened to Jesus' body is still a mystery, akin to Helen Brock's disappearance. There's not enough evidence, they say, to reach a firm conclusion. But others assert that the case is effectively closed, because there is conclusive proof that the tomb was vacant on that first Easter morning. And if you want someone to compellingly present that case, your best bet is to visit with William Lane Craig, widely considered to be among the world's foremost experts on the resurrection. The 11th interview. William Lane Craig, Ph.D., D.Th. I had an unusual perspective the first time I saw Bill Craig in action. I was seated behind him as he defended Christianity before a crowd of nearly 8,000 people, with countless others listening on more than 100 radio stations around the country. As moderator of a debate between Craig and an atheist selected by the national spokesman for American Atheists Incorporated, I marveled as Craig politely but powerfully built the case for Christianity, while simultaneously dismantling the arguments for atheism. From where I was sitting, I could watch the faces of people as they discovered, many for the first time, that Christianity can stand up to rational analysis and rugged scrutiny. In the end, it was no contest. Among those who had entered the auditorium that evening as avowed atheists, agnostics, or skeptics, an overwhelming 82% walked out concluding that the case for Christianity had been the most compelling. 47 people entered as non-believers and exited as Christians. Craig's arguments for the faith were that persuasive, especially compared with the paucity of evidence for atheism. Incidentally, nobody became an atheist. So when I flew down to Atlanta to interview him for this book, I was anxious to see how he'd respond to the challenges concerning the empty tomb of Jesus. He hadn't changed since I had seen him a few years earlier. With his close-cropped black beard, angular features, and riveting gaze, Craig still looks the role of a serious scholar. He speaks in cogent sentences, never losing his train of thought, always working through an answer methodically, point by point, fact by fact. Yet he isn't a dry theologian. Craig has a refreshing enthusiasm for his work. His pale blue eyes dance as he weaves elaborate propositions and theories. He punctuates his sentences with hand gestures that beckon for understanding and agreement. His voice modulates from near giddiness over some arcane theological point that he finds fascinating to hushed sincerity as he ponders why some scholars resist the evidence that he finds so compelling. In short, his mind is fully engaged, but so is his heart. When he talks about skeptics he has debated, it isn't with a smug or adversarial tone. He goes out of his way to mention their endearing qualities when he can. This one was a wonderful speaker. That one was charming over dinner. In the subtleties of our conversation, I sense that he isn't out to pummel opponents with his arguments. He's sincerely seeking to win over people whom he believes matter to God. He seems genuinely perplexed why some people cannot or will not recognize the reality of the empty tomb. Wearing blue jeans, white socks, and a dark blue sweater with a red turtleneck collar, Craig lounged on a floral couch in his living room. On the wall behind him was a large frame scene of Munich. It was there, fresh with a Master of Arts degree from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Birmingham, England, that Craig studied the resurrection for the first time while earning another doctorate, this one in theology from the University of Munich. Later, he taught at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and then served as a visiting scholar at the Higher Institute of Philosophy at the University of Louvain near Brussels. His books include Reasonable Faith, No Easy Answers, Knowing the Truth About the Resurrection, The Only Wise God, The Existence of God and the Beginning of the Universe, and, with Quentin Smith, Theism, Atheism, and Big Bang Cosmology, published by Oxford University Press. He also contributed to The Intellectuals Speak Out About God, Jesus Under Fire, In Defense of Miracles, and Does God Exist? In addition, his scholarly articles have appeared in such journals as New Testament Studies, Journal for the Study of the New Testament, Gospel Perspectives, Journal of the American Scientific Affiliation, and Philosophy. He is a member of 9 professional societies, including the American Academy of Religion and the American Philosophical Association. While he is internationally known for his writings about the intersection of science, philosophy, and theology, he needed no prompting to discuss the subject that still makes his heart beat fast, the resurrection of Jesus. Before looking at whether the tomb of Jesus was empty, I needed to establish whether his body had been there in the first place. History tells us that, as a rule, crucified criminals were left on the cross to be devoured by birds or were thrown into a common grave. This prompted John Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar to conclude that Jesus' body probably was dug up and consumed by wild dogs. Based on these customary practices, I said to Craig, wouldn't you admit that this is most likely what happened? If all you looked at was the customary practice, yes, I'd agree, came his reply. But that would ignore the specific evidence in this case. Okay, then let's look at the specific evidence, I said. With that, I pointed out an immediate problem. The Gospels say Jesus' corpse was turned over to Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the very council, the Sanhedrin, that voted to condemn Jesus. That's rather implausible, isn't it? I demanded in a tone that sounded more pointed than I had intended. Craig shifted on the couch as if he were getting ready to pounce on my question. No, not when you look at all the evidence for the burial, he said. So let me go through it. For one thing, the burial is mentioned by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7, where he passes on a very early creed of the church. I acknowledge this with a nod, since Dr. Craig Blomberg had already described this creed in some detail during our earlier interview. Craig agreed with Blomberg that the creed undoubtedly goes back to within a few years of Jesus' crucifixion, having been given to Paul after his conversion in Damascus or in his subsequent visit to Jerusalem when he met with the apostles James and Peter. Since Craig was going to be referring to the creed, I opened the Bible in my lap and quickly reviewed the passage. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. The creed then goes on to list several appearances of the resurrected Jesus. This creed is incredibly early and therefore trustworthy material, Craig said. Essentially, it's a 4-line formula. The first line refers to the crucifixion, the second to the burial, the third to the resurrection, and the fourth to Jesus' appearances. As you can see, the second line affirms that Jesus was buried. That was too vague for me. Wait a minute, I interjected. He may have been buried, but was it in a tomb? And was it through Joseph of Arimathea, this mysterious character who comes out of nowhere to claim the body? Craig remained patient. This creed is actually a summary that corresponds line by line with what the Gospels teach, he explained. When we turn to the Gospels, we find multiple, independent attestation of this burial story, and Joseph of Arimathea is specifically named in all 4 accounts. On top of that, the burial story in Mark is so extremely early that it's simply not possible for it to have been subject to legendary corruption. How can you tell it's early? I asked. 2 reasons, he said. First, Mark is generally considered to be the earliest gospel. Second, this gospel basically consists of short anecdotes about Jesus, more like pearls on a string than a smooth, continuous narrative. But when you get to the last week of Jesus' life, the so-called Passion story, then you do have a continuous narrative of events in sequence. This Passion story was apparently taken by Mark from an even earlier source, and this source included the story of Jesus being buried in the tomb. While those were good arguments, I spotted a problem with Mark's account of what happened. Mark says that the entire Sanhedrin voted to condemn Jesus, I said. If that's true, this means Joseph of Arimathea cast his ballot to kill Jesus. Isn't it highly unlikely that he would have then come to give Jesus an honorable burial? Apparently, my observation put me in good company. Luke may have felt the same discomfort, Craig said, which would explain why he added one important detail. Joseph of Arimathea wasn't present when the official vote was taken. So that would explain things. But the significant point about Joseph of Arimathea is that he would not be the sort of person who would have been invented by Christian legend or Christian authors. I needed more than merely a conclusion on that matter. I wanted some solid reasoning. Why not? I asked. Given the early Christian anger and bitterness toward the Jewish leaders who had instigated the crucifixion of Jesus, he said, it's highly improbable that they would have invented one who did the right thing by giving Jesus an honorable burial, especially while all of Jesus' disciples deserted him. Besides, they wouldn't make up a specific member of a specific group whom people could check out for themselves and ask about this. So Joseph is undoubtedly a historical figure. Before I could ask a follow-up question, Craig continued. I'll add that if this burial by Joseph were a legend that developed later, you'd expect to find other competing burial traditions about what happened to Jesus' body. However, you don't find these at all. As a result, the majority of New Testament scholars today agree that the burial account of Jesus is fundamentally reliable. John A.T. Robinson, the late Cambridge University New Testament scholar, said the honorable burial of Jesus is one of the earliest and best attested facts that we have about the historical Jesus. Craig's explanations satisfied me that Jesus' body was indeed placed in Joseph's tomb. But the creed left an ambiguity. Perhaps, even after the resurrection, his body remained entombed. While the creed says Jesus was crucified, buried, and then resurrected, it doesn't specifically say the tomb was empty, I pointed out. Doesn't this leave room for the possibility that the resurrection was only spiritual in nature and that Jesus' body was still in the tomb? The creed definitely implies the empty tomb, Craig countered. You see, the Jews had a physical concept of resurrection. For them, the primary object of the resurrection was the bones of the deceased, not even the flesh, which was thought to be perishable. After the flesh rotted away, the Jews would gather the bones of their deceased and put them in boxes to be preserved until the resurrection at the end of the world, when God would raise the righteous dead of Israel and they would come together in the final kingdom of God. In light of this, it would have been simply a contradiction of terms for an early Jew to say that someone was raised from the dead, but his body still was left in the tomb. So when this early Christian creed says Jesus was buried and then raised on the third day, it's saying implicitly, but quite clearly, an empty tomb was left behind. Having heard convincing evidence that Jesus had been in the tomb, it seemed important to know how secure his grave was from outside influences. The tighter the security, the less likely the body could have been tampered with. How protected was Jesus' tomb? I asked. Craig proceeded to describe how this kind of tomb looked, as best as archaeologists have been able to determine from excavations of first-century sites. There was a slanted groove that led down to a low entrance, and a large disc-shaped stone was rolled down this groove and lodged into place across the door, he said, using his hands to illustrate what he was saying. A smaller stone was then used to secure the disc. Although it would be easy to roll this big disc down the groove, it would take several men to roll the stone back up in order to reopen the tomb. In that sense, it was quite secure. However, was Jesus' tomb also guarded? I knew that some skeptics have attempted to cast doubt on the popular belief that Jesus' tomb was carefully watched around the clock by highly disciplined Roman soldiers who faced death themselves if they failed in their duty. Are you convinced there were Roman guards? I asked. Only Matthew reports that guards were placed around the tomb, he replied. But in any event, I don't think the guard story is an important facet of the evidence for the resurrection. For one thing, it's too disputed by contemporary scholarship. I find it's prudent to base my arguments on evidence that's most widely accepted by the majority of scholars, so the guard story is better left aside. I was surprised by his approach. Doesn't that weaken your case? I asked. Craig shook his head. Frankly, the guard story may have been important in the 18th century when critics were suggesting that the disciples stole Jesus' body, but nobody espouses that theory today, he responded. When you read the New Testament, he continued, there's no doubt that the disciples sincerely believed the truth of the resurrection. The idea that the empty tomb is a result of some hoax, conspiracy, or theft is simply dismissed today. So the guard story has become sort of incidental. Even so, I was interested whether there was any evidence to back up Matthew's assertion about the guards. Although I understood Craig's reason for setting aside the issue, I pressed ahead by asking whether there was any good evidence that the guard story is historical. Yes, there is, he said. Think about the claims and counterclaims about the resurrection that went back and forth between the Jews and the Christians in the first century. The initial Christian proclamation was, Jesus is risen. The Jews responded, the disciples stole his body. To this, Christians said, but the guards at the tomb would have prevented such a theft. The Jews responded, but the guards at the tomb fell asleep. To that, the Christians replied, no, the Jews bribed the guards to say they fell asleep. Now, if there had not been any guards, the exchange would have gone like this. In response to the claim Jesus is risen, the Jews would say, no, the disciples stole his body. Christians would reply, but the guards would have prevented the theft. Then the Jews' response would have been, what guards? You're crazy. There were no guards. Yet history tells us that's not what the Jews said. This suggests the guards really were historical, and that the Jews knew it, which is why they had to invent the absurd story about the guards having been asleep while the disciples took the body. Again, a nagging question prompted me to jump in. There seems to be another problem here, I said, pausing as I tried to formulate my objection as succinctly as I could. Why would the Jewish authorities have placed guards at the tomb in the first place? If they were anticipating a resurrection, or the disciples faking one, this would mean they had a better understanding of Jesus' predictions about his resurrection than the disciples did. After all, the disciples were surprised by the whole thing. You've hit on something there, Craig conceded. However, maybe they placed the guards there to prevent any sort of tomb robbery or other disturbances from happening during Passover. We don't know. That's a good argument. I grant its full force, but I don't think it's insuperable. Yes, but it does raise some questions concerning the guard story. Plus, another objection came to mind.
Matthew says the Roman guards reported to the Jewish authorities, I said, but doesn't that seem unlikely since they were responsible to Pilate?
A slight smile came to Craig's face. If you look carefully, he said, Matthew doesn't say the guards are Romans. When the Jews go to Pilate and ask for a guard, Pilate says, "You have a guard." Now, does he mean, all right, here's a detachment of Roman soldiers? Or does he mean, you've got your own temple guards, use them? Scholars have debated whether or not it was a Jewish guard. I was initially inclined, for the reason you mentioned, to think that the guard was Jewish. I've rethought that, however, because the word Matthew uses to refer to the guards is often used with respect to Roman soldiers rather than just temple officers. And remember, John tells us it was a Roman centurion who led Roman soldiers to arrest Jesus under the direction of Jewish leadership. So there is precedent for Roman guards reporting to Jewish religious leaders. It seems plausible that they could also be involved in the guarding of the tomb. Weighing the evidence, I felt persuaded that guards had been present, but I decided to drop the line of questioning since Craig doesn't rely on the guard story anyway. Meanwhile, I was anxious to confront Craig with what seems to be the most persuasive argument against the idea that Jesus' tomb was vacant on Easter morning. Through the years, critics of Christianity have attacked the empty tomb story by pointing out apparent discrepancies among the gospel accounts. For example, skeptic Charles Templeton said, "The four descriptions of events differ so markedly at so many points that, with all the goodwill in the world, they cannot be reconciled." Taken at face value, this objection seems to penetrate to the heart of the reliability of the empty tomb narratives. Consider this summary by Dr. Michael Martin of Boston University, which I read to Craig that morning. In Matthew, when Mary Magdalene and the other Mary arrived toward dawn at the tomb, there is a rock in front of it. There is a violent earthquake, and an angel descends and rolls back the stone. In Mark, the women arrive at the tomb at sunrise, and the stone had been rolled back. In Luke, when the women arrive at early dawn, they find the stone had already been rolled back. In Matthew, an angel is sitting on the rock outside the tomb, and in Mark, a youth is inside the tomb. In Luke, 2 men are inside. In Matthew, the women present at the tomb are Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. In Mark, the women present at the tomb are the 2 Marys and Salome. In Luke, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Joanna, and the other women are present at the tomb. In Matthew, the 2 Marys rush from the tomb in great fear and joy, run to tell the disciples, and meet Jesus on the way. In Mark, they run out of the tomb in fear and say nothing to anyone. In Luke, the women report the story to the disciples, who do not believe them, and there is no suggestion that they meet Jesus. And, I said to Craig, Martin points out that John conflicts with much of the other 3 Gospels. He concludes, in some, the accounts of what happened at the tomb are either inconsistent or can only be made consistent with the aid of implausible interpretations. I stopped reading and looked up from my notes. My eyes locking with Craig's, I asked him point blank, "In light of all of this, how in the world can you possibly consider the empty tomb story to be credible?" Immediately I noticed something about Craig's demeanor. In casual conversation or when discussing tepid objections to the empty tomb, he's rather mellow. But the tougher the question and the more piercing the challenge, the more animated and